Thank you everyone for coming, and I would like to thank Dr Angela McCarthy for inviting me here this afternoon to share my thoughts about Elijah's encounter with Yahweh at Horeb. And that encounter is described in 1 Kings chapter 19 verses 11b to 13. And that encounter with Yahweh at Horeb has given Elijah new courage to meet or face the demands of his prophetic career. And in this regard, my thoughts will extend beyond verses 11b to 13, which is the prescribed text for this afternoon. I would like to talk beyond this prescribed text because I like to set the text in context. Right? Now, I would like to begin with a sketch of the events leading up to Elijah's meeting with Yahweh and their correlation with the wilderness tradition in the books of Exodus and Numbers. Okay? Because those events form an important backdrop for understanding, for appreciating the theophanic event on Horeb in chapter 19 of 1 Kings. Now, the prophet Elijah makes an abrupt appearance after 1 Kings chapter 16, after a short narrative in 1 Kings chapter 16. And that short narrative describes King Ahab's marriage to Jezebel. Jezebel is the daughter, or was the daughter, of King Baal of the Sidonians. That narrative also describes Ahab's role in the erection of an altar to Baal, God Baal, the Canaanite god Baal. The Canaanite god Baal is thought to be responsible for bringing the life-saving rain to the land at certain times of the year, and thus restoring the fertility to the land. Okay? Elijah's prediction of a drought upon his appearance in the narrative is a direct challenge to the power of the storm god Baal. Okay? Now, the drought occurs as Elijah had predicted, and after a 3-year drought, Yahweh decides to send in the rain to water the land as proof that he alone has power over the natural elements. Right? He alone has control over the fertility and the sterility of the land. So the drought ends with a heavy downpour after Elijah's prevails over the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel in a contest that culminates in the slaying of all the prophets of Baal. Okay? And Jezebel, the wife of King Ahab, hears about Elijah's deed, and she threatens to kill Elijah. Right?
Oh, typically religious behavior. Who's going to kill him?
So Elijah's response is to flee. Okay? He wants to flee. And the Hebrew text reflects Elijah's panic in a repeat series of short clauses. Okay? The verse says, Elijah feared, and he arose, and he fled for his life. And by the 4th clause in that verse, Elijah is already in Judah. In Beersheba, in the land of Judah. And Beersheba is about 200 kilometers south of Mount Carmel. Beersheba is outside the jurisdiction of King Ahab and Jezebel. Okay? And he travels for another day, and he enters the desert of the Negev desert. And there he prays to Yahweh. He says, "Enough, O Lord, enough. Take away my life now, for I am no better than my ancestors." And then after that prayer, he travels for another 40 days and 40 nights, and he arrived at Mount Horeb. And then the narrator reports, at that place he come to a cave and spent the night there. At that place he came to a cave and he spent the night there. Now Elijah's journey to Horeb, I need to explain this because it has important implication for understanding the encounter on Mount Horeb. Okay, Elijah's journey to Horeb draws heavily on the wilderness tradition in the books of Exodus and Numbers. And the Deuteronomistic historian of that narrative considers Elijah to be like a prophet, to be a prophet like Moses, right? Moses. Now his journey of 40 days and 40 nights evokes memories of Israel's 40 days and 40 years sojourn in the wilderness under the guidance of Moses. It also brings to mind the 40 days and 40 nights that Moses spent on Mount Sinai to receive Yahweh's Torah, Yahweh's law. And Elijah's prayer to Yahweh to take away his life also evokes memories of Moses' complaint to Yahweh about his heavy responsibility in leading the Israelites across the wilderness. And Moses' complaint includes a demand to Yahweh that Yahweh assures him of his abiding presence, or Moses will abandon his role as prophet, as leader of the Israelites. Even episodes in Elijah's meeting with Yahweh on Mount Horeb, as I will explain later on, hark back to Moses' complaint to Yahweh in the wilderness tradition. So enlightened by this background that I've just sketched to you, we can turn our attention to the narrative about Elijah's meeting with Yahweh at Horeb.
Could that be an ideal moment to actually read the text? Because some people might not be
familiar. All right. Yeah, sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah. Would you like to read that?
I will.
Yeah.
This is a reading from the 1 Kings 19, 11 to 13. He said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Now there was a great wind, so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a sound of sheer silence. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave.
Okay, so the narrative about Yahweh's appearance to Elijah begins with his arrival at Horeb, where he spends the night in a cave, and there the word of Yahweh comes to him, saying, as Angela has just read, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah answers, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." And in response, Yahweh gives Elijah this command: go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. Okay? And then Yahweh, and they had a conversation in the cave. Now, the the dialogue. The dialogue in the caves employs the prophetic formula, what we call prophetic formula, and the prophetic formula is the word of Yahweh came to him. Okay? That prophetic formula portrays an encounter between Yahweh and Elijah. But the narrative does not explain the precise nature of the encounter. And interestingly, when Elijah finally meets Yahweh outside the cave, the same dialogue transpires between them. And various solutions have been offered for this puzzling duplication. Now, it is thought that the repetition of Yahweh's question reflected the repeated course of the prophet's name during visionary experiences. Okay? And as for Elijah's verbatim answer, it has been argued that it emphasizes the major themes of Elijah's zealousness for Yahweh and Israel's abandonment of its covenant with Yahweh. I think there is a simpler solution to this issue of duplication, in that it is possible to interpret Yahweh's dialogue with Elijah in the cave as an occurrence within a dream. Now, the preceding clause, which says that Elijah spent the night in the cave, supports this interpretation that the word of Yahweh happens to Elijah while he was asleep. And it's not unusual for Yahweh to communicate in dreams, because that phenomenon appears in many places in the Old Testament. In sum, what I'm trying to say is that the dialogue that occurs in the cave anticipates the theophanic dialogue outside the cave, or the dialogue outside the cave is an enactment of the dialogue in Elijah's dream, right? Now, Elijah's encounter with Yahweh outside the cave is preceded by a great wind, a wind so strong that it was splitting mountains and breaking rocks in pieces before the Lord, before Yahweh. Okay? And this clause, before Yahweh, is often overlooked. This Hebrew clause, Lifnei Adonai, means in the presence of the Lord, or literally before the face of Yahweh. Before the face of Yahweh. The role of the wind is to announce the arrival of Yahweh. The wind is not to be identified with Yahweh. And the narrative stresses this point by asserting that Yahweh was not in the wind. Similarly, the narrative says that Yahweh was not in the earthquake. Yahweh was not in the fire. Then after the fire, there was a sound of sure silence. There was a sound of sure silence. The Hebrew phrase Kol Bemama Dakar, that the NRSV translation of the Hebrew Bible renders that Hebrew phrase as a sound of sure silence. That Hebrew phrase has been variously translated as a gentle little breeze, a soft murmuring sound, and a gentle whisper. And Kol Dimama Dakar, in my view, refers to the silence and calm that follow the cessation of fire. That follows the cessation of fire. Therefore, the translation, a sound of sure silence, captures perfectly the scene at Horeb after the storm had Now, the pattern in the preceding description of wind, earthquake, and fire breaks here in that the denial of Yahweh's presence does not follow. The narrator does not say the Lord was not in the silence. The narrator does not say that the Lord was not in the silence. Therefore, the narrator prepares the scene for the appearance of Yahweh to Elijah in the midst of the sure silence, in the midst of the utter silence. Now, when Elijah senses the calm and the silence, the sure silence, he wraps his face in his mantle or cloak and goes out and stands at the entrance of the cave. Now, his action of wrapping his face in his mantle or cloak as he leaves the cave is not an act of protection for fear that the storm might return, but one done in anticipation of a meeting with Yahweh. Now, he shields himself, he covers himself so that he does not see the divine face. In the same way that Moses, or rather in the same way that Yahweh had covered Moses' face with his hand and he passes before Moses in response to Moses' demand for an assurance of the divine presence, so that he may find strength to continue his role as Israel's prophet and leader. So Yahweh's word that came to Elijah in the cave prepared him for his meeting with Yahweh outside the cave. And with his face in his cloak, Elijah only hears the voice of Yahweh asking him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah answers Yahweh as he did in his dream. Elijah says, "I have been very zealous for the Lord, the God of hosts, for the Israelites have forsaken your covenant, thrown down your altars, and killed your prophets with the sword. I alone am left, and they are seeking my life to take it away." Now, in the dream that happened in the cave, Elijah's answer is followed by Yahweh's command to him to leave the cave and to meet him outside. Now that he's already outside the cave, Yahweh gives him a new command. Yahweh says, "Go, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus. When you arrive, you shall anoint Hazael as king over Aram. Also you shall anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. And you shall anoint Elijah, son of Shaphat, of Abel Meholah, as prophet in the place. And whoever escapes from the sword of Hazael, Jehu shall kill. And whoever escapes from the sword of Jehu, Elijah shall kill. Yet I will leave 7,000 in Israel, all the knees that have not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him." Now, Yahweh's command to Elijah constitutes a new prophetic commission, with new tasks for Elijah to perform. And the subsequent verse indicates that Elijah offers no objection. The verse simply says, "And he went from there." The verse says, "And he went from there." The word "there" has been used at the beginning of the narrative to refer to the cave at Horeb. And therefore, when it says at the end of the narrative that he went from there, it means he went from the cave in which he had sought refuge. So he went from the cave where he had sought refuge. Now, Elijah's meeting with Yahweh amidst the sure silence on Mount Horeb has assured him of Yahweh's abiding presence. And that experience has given him new courage to leave his hiding place, to continue with his prophetic ministry and to focus on accomplishing the new task that Yahweh has given him. Is to focus on those tasks rather than to focus on his trouble with Jezebel. It was a liberating experience for Elijah. It was an experience of conversion. A conversion from fear and disorientation to renewed faith and sense of purpose. And with that, I come to the end of my reflection about Elijah's meeting with Yahweh on Mount Horeb.
I might just clarify a few terms. Deeply respect Lawrence as a theologian and scriptural theologian and Old Testament particularly, but there might be some names in there that you don't get. Is that right? The name Horeb, the other name for that is Sinai. Is that a more familiar name? Mount Sinai. Mount Sinai, it comes from one translation, Mount Horeb from another, but they mean the same mountain, the mountain where God gave the law to Moses. Elijah, one of the prophets, and that fits into the big scheme, the big idea of how God relates to a group of people. The whole of these writings, there's many different authors, there are many different eras. The writings we're talking about in the Old Testament were written over around about 1,000 years. So in that 1,000 years, a whole lot of people have contributed to those writings. So the imagery, I don't have Lawrence's expertise in Hebrew and all of that, I deeply respect that, but the imagery in there actually changes over time. The prophets were a really particular, strong group of people who spoke for God. And the term that Lawrence is using for God is Yahweh, one of the most ancient of the Hebrew terms. But in this NRSV, it's translated as Lord God. It's actually a deeply sacred name, and it shouldn't be uttered, and certainly not uttered in worship because it's too sacred a name. And it goes way back in the history. So after Moses had drawn the people out of Egypt, this is in the big story, gone to Mount Sinai, Horeb, and received the Ten Commandments, wandered in the desert for 40 years, then finally come to the Promised Land. In that Promised Land, though, it wasn't all milk and honey. It was a lot of fighting and a lot of arguing and a lot of butchering of each other, which seems to continue today in Israel, but that's political comment. But they still have this fractious thing. Then they want a king. They want to get a king. That will solve their problems. So God says, no, God's the king. I'm the king. And then they said, no, we want a king. So eventually a kingdom is set up. Then they fight. So 2 kingdoms are set up. Now, Elijah was up in the northern kingdom of Israel, but comes down to the kingdom of Judah to escape Ahab and Jezebel. Jezebel's a real nasty lady. She was into killing prophets. So he escapes and comes back down. When he is there in the southern kingdom then is when he has this extraordinary theophany. And a theophany is a meeting with God of a very profound, life-changing variety. Like Moses met God in the burning bush on the same mountain, and that changed his life big time. So we've got several different things happening here. We've got a prophet, we've got trouble, we've got wars happening, people getting killed. We've got a conflict with a false god, Baal, and that god, the people are worshipping and honouring that god. Just prior to this story, there's been a terrible fight between the prophets of Baal and between Elijah. The king thinks that it was Elijah's fault that they got the drought. So then they have, Elijah says, well, we'll set up and you have a sacrifice to Baal. See if Baal lights it up for you, and then I'll build one and see if my God lights this up. And of course, the people of Baal worked, and it didn't happen for Elijah, though it happened. So we have that conflict happening in the story. So if any of that language, and I know it's ancient language and, you know, we kind of use it and think it might be common, but if it's not, ask the questions. I'd now hand over to Bob Booth, because one of the constant questions that seems to be coming through is how do we, as artists, work with a theme like that? So